virtual town hall. I'm excited that you're with us, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. Thank you, and we hope this is a valuable hour or so where you're going to learn a lot about COVID-19 and other things that are happening in our region. I want to take just a minute before we get to our guests and before we update our constituents on some of the things happening here in Washington, D.C. Just a reminder of how severe this pandemic is throughout the Southern California region. And just to reiterate again, the importance of taking all safety precautions. In Southern California, as we are seeing every day, intensive care unit capacity is really at near zero. The number keeps dropping every day. Our case numbers are dramatically increasing. The death toll is rapidly rising. And healthcare experts, including one you're going to hear from in a moment, are reminding us that this is going to get worse until vaccines are widely distributed to the American people, which the good news is that will happen soon. And perhaps we'll be talking about a schedule on the vaccine distribution. But in the meantime, please avoid large gatherings, avoid the things that we know are the causes of community transmission. And look, I know how hard it is to stay away from your loved ones during the holidays. My wife and I have an annual tradition of going out to see our in-laws and our extended family in Arizona. If they're watching, hello, and I love you. We didn't get to go and see them in person this year for the first time in many years for Thanksgiving. Just the same, I know on Christmas morning, for the first time since I can remember, my parents will not be able to share with our children, with their grandchildren in the opening of presents the way that they normally would under the Christmas tree. So it's a different year for sure, but I would just encourage everyone, please take this seriously. Keep yourself safe, keep others safe, and please consider staying home and have your holiday celebrations virtually if you can. Because as we work together to beat this virus, it is so important to think about next Thanksgiving, next Christmas, next Hanukkah, and the opportunity that we'll have in 2021 to be with our loved ones as before, if we just stay the course and make sure that we take those precautions until the vaccine becomes more widely distributed. With that, I'm going to keep holding these virtual town halls as often as we can, and I'm very grateful to my team for putting them together. Our wonderful Chief of Staff, Caravan Stralin here in Washington, D.C., our Communications Director, Eric Mee, our great legislative team, all of our staff in the district office as well, and of course, Jeremy, who makes the video conferencing all come together. And I am grateful, as those of you who watch these town halls know, they began about 10 months ago, and our very first guest was Dr. Richard Garfien. And he's been back a number of times. I'm so grateful that he's back again today. He is a distinguished professor and epidemiologist for the Department of Medicine in the Global Public Health Division at UC San Diego. I know he worked at the CDC in Atlanta for, I believe, 7.5 years. Probably has a lot of thoughts on what's happening there as well. But welcome back, Dr. Garfien, and thank you so much for joining us. Well,
thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Richard. Before I turn it over to Richard for some opening remarks, I want to share the latest numbers of COVID-19 that we're seeing. Very sadly, we're now over 306,000 deaths from COVID-19, almost 17 million cases. California has confirmed over 1.6 million, approaching 1.7 million cases, 21,681 deaths. San Diego County, 111,141 cases and 1,194 deaths. Orange County, 111,168 cases and 1,718 deaths. And as you probably know, on December 3rd, Governor Newsom announced a regional stay-home order for the state, for particularly for those regions with less than 15% ICU capacity, ICU availability, and that prohibits private gatherings of any size, closes sector operations except for critical infrastructure and retail, and requires masking and physical distancing. And on December the 7th, just a few days later, that order took effect in Southern California. We're all bundled together as a Southern California region with LA and with Orange County and San Diego as one region. And the latest numbers as of yesterday, it was at 1.7% ICU capacity. So we are well below the 15% threshold. A list of what this all means for different businesses is available on the state's website, covid19.ca.gov. And I encourage you to check that out if you have any questions about the different businesses. Over the past 7 days, San Diego County has reported an average of 2,285 cases and 15.1 deaths per day, significantly higher numbers than we've seen really at any time during this pandemic. There are now 1,103 patients in San Diego County with a confirmed case. The numbers in Orange County this past week, an average of 2,489 cases per day, 8.9 deaths per day, and 1,486 patients with a confirmed case. This is a dire situation. And again, I plead with our viewers, please follow the public health and safety recommendations from the federal guidance, the state guidance, the county guidance. Do it for yourself, do it for your loved ones, do it for your community. Let's come together as best we can. And to the extent that we see our friends or our family or our coworkers or our neighbors that aren't following those guidelines, let's caution and let's recommend that they do so as best as we can. As I said at the outset, I am back in Washington, D.C., and I will be here as long as it takes to get another COVID relief bill across the finish line. The good news here is that we've made a lot of progress in the last 72 hours. I am very pleased to report there is currently a bipartisan, bicameral proposal. It's going through its various iterations and discussions. But it's around a $900 billion proposal. And as of right now, again, we need to see the final language before we vote, hopefully this week. It would include a $600 direct cash payment, $300 expanded unemployment insurance, the money for our schools, $82 billion for schools, $35 billion for healthcare providers. There's money in there for transportation. There's money in there for, importantly, for the vaccine distribution, about $6 billion, and quite a bit else, nutrition and other things that absolutely are critically important to our community. It doesn't have everything that we had fought for or advocated for. Importantly, it lacks the $160 billion that we'd advocated for state and local government. It does have several tens of billions of dollars for things that would help our states, but it doesn't have that direct funding for our localities and our counties, which is a disappointment. It also, though, doesn't have the language that Mitch McConnell has been fighting for tooth and nail to provide liability waivers for big corporations. Basically, you know, the thinking on his part is employers should be completely shielded from liability if their employees get sick or even die of COVID-19, virtually regardless of the circumstances and virtually in perpetuity. We've gone back and forth trying to get that language in a better place, and we haven't been able to get there. So the most recent iteration of the discussions centers around a bill that excludes the liability waiver entirely, but also excludes the state and local funding. That's something we're going to have to come back to once we've got President Joe Biden in the Oval Office after January 20. But again, I'm not going home until I know the job is done. I've seen the lines of our local community members at food banks. I've seen our veterans and our local workforce struggling. I have seen our doctors and nurses who are extremely concerned about having the resources for vaccine distribution. And I'm very mindful that this holiday season, a lot of people will not have the money for basic necessities unless Congress comes through. So we're going to fight like crazy to get that done. The other thing I will mention, there are a couple other really good pieces of legislation that I wanted to highlight during all of this. One thing is, last Tuesday, the Water Resources Development Act passed the House of Representatives with very important priorities for North County, San Diego, and South Orange County. It has money for the Del Mar Bluffs Shoreline Project, the authorization of the Del Mar Bluffs Shoreline Project, the Oceanside Special Shoreline Study, and the San Luis Rey River Flood Protection Project. And look, these are important projects for our community. We are making solid and substantive progress on all of them. And I'm really encouraged, and I'm very grateful for the hard work of my team, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, working with our appropriators here and the other relevant stakeholders here to make sure that we deliver on those priorities for North County and for our district. The other thing that I will mention is the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. That passed the House and the Senate with broad majorities. The president has threatened to veto the NDAA. It would be the first time in 60 years that would happen. It's a critically important bill for our military and our military families and our veterans as well. It's $740 billion bill, 3% pay raise for our military, et cetera, and $152.5 million for Camp Pendleton alone, for facilities and infrastructure at Camp Pendleton. So this is a huge deal. And I'm hopeful that the president will not veto the bill. He's threatened to do so over the lack of language on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which I think, and many people of both parties think, is just misdirected, misguided. And we're very hopeful that that does not occur. But we do have the votes in the House and the Senate, we believe, to override the veto. You need a 2/3 to do that. And finally, and I'm really excited about this, earlier today, the House passed H.R. 7105. This is a major veterans bill that I've been working on for the better part of 2 years. And I'm so grateful to our team, Faith Williams on our personal staff and the staff of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. They have done an amazing job. And basically what had happened with this bill, it incorporated a lot of the different legislation that I and my colleagues have been working on over the course of the last 2 years around veteran employment, housing, doing a lot of different things during the pandemic to try to really help those veterans most in need. And so we wrapped it all up in a bill called the Deliver Act, Dependable Employment and Living Improvements for Veterans Economic Recovery. We passed that in the House. We sent it to the Senate. The Senate added to the bill. They added additional provisions, which were good provisions, to the bill, which meant that it had to come back to the House and pass again in the House. And with floor time and the end of the year being what it is, that was no guarantee. But today, the bill passed the House again in its revised format, and it is now going to the president for his signature. And I am really, really encouraged. This is going to help provide more services for homeless veterans, strengthen GI Bill benefits, improve the transition assistance program for service members returning to civilian life, and a whole lot more. And I'm just super grateful again to my team and to my colleagues like Gus Bilirakis of Florida, Jody Arrington of Texas, and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and Phil Rowe, Dr. Phil Rowe, who's the ranking member of Tennessee. He's retiring from the House. We decided that there's no better send-off than for the bill to be named after him and after Johnny Isaacson, who is retiring in the Senate. They're the two top-ranking Republicans in House and Senate. This was truly, truly a bipartisan bill, and that's how Washington is supposed to work. And I think it's a reminder that Washington can still work. So with that, there's a lot going on, but I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Garfien for his opening remarks. And again, Richard, it's great to see you.
Thank you, Congressman, and it's a pleasure to be back. It's great to hear about all the progress that's happening in Washington right now, especially with how challenging things can be, especially with you traveling back and forth. So I appreciate your efforts. There's been a lot going on in the last few weeks. We have a vaccine now, and I think that I wanted to take a few minutes and just touch on that subject because I think people are interested in, and also concerned. And I want to try to address some of those concerns. So, I think that there was a lot of attention to holding the FDA to account so that they wouldn't shortcut the process. I think during the the build up to having a vaccine, I think people were rightfully concerned that politics had really invaded the scientific process. And there was concern that things might be rushed and that the vaccine might not be as effective as it should be, or potentially have problems with it. And people were concerned about whether or not the vaccine would work and they should take it. And so I just want to say that, you know, the NIH funded researchers designed trials that would allow for overlap of some of the phases, so they can do phase 1 and 2 in parallel and getting ready for phase 3 trials, as opposed to doing them sequentially like they normally would, which really helped to expedite the process. In addition, the FDA removed a lot of the barriers to that review process, to looking at the data to see whether or not that the trials worked the way that they did. And that also expedited the process. And so even though this process went at lightning speed, way faster than anything I've ever seen in my lifetime, the process still worked correctly. All the safety checks were in place, and these trials were done correctly. And I can also verify that because I know people who've been working on these trials at UCSD and other institutions, and those protocols went through our IRBs, they went through the NIH's ethics committees. And so this wasn't something that was shortcutted. It was just something that was really expedited. So the data that are coming out of these trials now are really exciting, and I think that people should have faith in them. But I think as a consequence of all this skepticism of the process and this concern, I think it's left a little bit of a residual effect, and I think that's what I'm concerned about, and I want to try to address. So, you know, there's this one concern is that people may have side effects from the vaccine. There might be adverse effects. Many people are concerned about vaccines in general, and particularly if it's a vaccine that went through as quickly as this one did. And so what tends to happen is people have illnesses, and they die of many, many things. But if it happens to occur within a short period of time after somebody received the vaccine, maybe a few days after somebody gets vaccinated, they have a heart attack and they die, you know, that raises concerns, and people naturally associate that event with the possibility of the vaccine. And then so they might start talking about that, and then somebody else has a similar event and they say, oh yeah, that happened to somebody I know too. And pretty soon you start to get an accumulation of these events, and everybody starts thinking that there's something really going on there. And I think that's natural. But I think we have to step back and say, well, is that real, or is that just a coincidence? And one way that we can look at that is by looking at the data from these clinical trials that were done with the vaccine. And when you actually take people and you randomly assign them to receive the vaccine or receive a placebo, and then you look to see what the frequency of these side effects were in those two groups, that's where you can really sort of get a balance, so that you're seeing whether or not there's a difference due to the vaccine. And so in the Pfizer trial that just completed, there were a few more of the minor side effects among people that received the vaccine, such as, you know, pain at the injection site, fatigue, some muscle pain, chills, joint pain, maybe some fever. But this is sort of what you'd naturally expect when the body's ramping up to make antibodies against a virus. But when we look at the serious adverse events that occurred, there were only 0.6% of serious adverse events among people who were in the vaccine group, and 0.5% in the placebo group. So essentially no difference. And when you look at it, this is actually the same rate of these kinds of events that you would see in the general population, whether they received a vaccine or not. So this really sort of gives evidence to the fact that there really isn't anything seriously happening with people that are receiving the vaccine that would cause concern for the vaccine leading to these adverse events. And I think people really have to pay attention to that. So don't get caught up in these stories where, Uncle Joe just got the vaccine and he died and therefore it must have been the vaccine. You really have to look at the data. And so then, the next question is, well, who's getting the vaccine? We have it now. Pfizer's vaccine is coming out. Moderna's vaccine looks like it's going to be coming out here very shortly as well, also with positive results. And so how do we decide who gets it? Well, if we had unlimited supplies, everybody would get it. But unfortunately, the supply is limited right now. And so the CDC has the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or the ACIP, and this is the group that reviews all of the vaccines that we get in our country. And this is what they do on a routine basis. And when they had to decide which groups would get the vaccine. And so, some things that they consider and the goals for the vaccine that they looked at were decreasing death and serious disease as much as possible, preserving functioning of society, reducing the extra burden of disease that it's having on people who are facing disparities, and it needs to increase the chance for everyone to enjoy a healthy health and well-being. So that was their goals. And then with that, they considered four important groups for receiving the vaccine first, and that would include healthcare personnel, workers in essential and critical industries, people who are at high risk for severe COVID illness due to underlying medical conditions, and people who are 65 and older. And in making their decisions, they didn't just do this haphazardly, they actually considered a whole series of ethical principles that guide their decisions. And these include things like maximizing the benefits and minimizing the harms, mitigating health inequities, promoting justice, promoting transparency. So this is a very, very thorough process in coming up with this decision. It wasn't taken lightly, and I certainly hope so, and I don't think it was influenced by politics or money or influence. So anyway, what they came up with for this first phase, and they're calling it phase 1A, and it was just decided on December 13th, is that the first two groups that will receive the vaccine will be healthcare personnel, which are defined as people who are paid or unpaid, people serving in healthcare settings who have the potential for direct or indirect exposure to patients or infectious materials. And the second group are long-term care facility residents. Those are people that live in assisted living and need medical and other assistance in their daily living. And so that's the first group that's getting the vaccine. They've already started. Yesterday, vaccination started. It's very exciting, and I've seen lots of reports of healthcare workers getting vaccinated, and they're thrilled. So just a couple key talking points here are that the vaccine cannot give anyone COVID-19. There's no live virus in it. The vaccine's most common side effects are a sore arm, but some people might get a headache or a fever. It takes 2 shots of the vaccine to get the full protection, and with the Pfizer vaccine, that's 95% protection, so pretty darn amazing. And the vaccine is not a perfect fix. So until we really get a good handle on the disease in our communities, we still need to take precautions like wearing masks and physical distancing and hand washing. So I'll just end that intro by saying we spent $9 billion to create a vaccine in record time, which is a ton of money, as the congressman knows, but we did it. So now what we need to do is we need to do the best job we can to get the vaccine out there and avoid spreading misinformation that's going to keep people from getting the vaccine.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Garfien. And I have to tell you, I'm so incredibly impressed by all of the companies and the great work that was done to get that vaccine ready for the American people in record time. And it's going to be a much better 2021. Of course, in the meantime, we've got to deal with the fact that we don't have enough vaccine for everyone who needs it just yet. But really encouraging signs and a light at the end of the tunnel, but nonetheless, we are still in the tunnel. And we have a ton of questions this week, and I'll get right to them. The first is for you, Doctor, and it's from Constance in Oceanside, who asks, can you please go into detail about the necessity to continue wearing masks and social distancing, even if you've previously contracted COVID and are now considered immune? I think a lot of people are not taking proper precautions after they've contracted COVID because they consider themselves immune.
That's a really great question, Constance, and it's one in which the science is still evolving. One thing we know for sure is that reinfections do happen. For example, South Korean scientists reported that the first suspected reinfection took place back in April, but it took until August 24th before the first case of reinfection was actually confirmed. This is a 33-year-old man who was treated in a Hong Kong hospital for a mild case in March and then tested positive again at a Hong Kong airport in August of 2015 after returning from a trip to Spain. Since then, there's been at least 24 reinfections that have been officially confirmed, but scientists say this is an underestimate. And the reason for that is because scientists are very scrutinizing, and they don't believe that something really happens unless there's evidence. And in order to verify that somebody had a reinfection as opposed to they just never got over it, or maybe some viral particles were lingering in their system and they just haven't all been flushed out yet, you would need to have some of the virus from the first infection and the second infection, and then you could do a genetic sequencing to look at the two viruses and see if they're actually the same. And if they're different, then that would indicate that it's a reinfection as opposed to the original one just never going away. And that's a really high bar because oftentimes when people are tested, the virus isn't saved after the test, and so it's very hard to get that first sample. But nonetheless, there have been now documented cases from around the world, and so we know it's happening. Probably not, it's happening, and probably not so much that we have to be hugely concerned about it, but it can happen. So because of that, it means that we have to be careful. Even though somebody has had the infection before, we don't want to assume that they're immune and that they're never going to get it again. It's kind of like the common cold. Some people get more than one cold in a season. And so until we get a better understanding of how reinfection occurs, who's susceptible to reinfection, how frequently it happens, what the effect of the vaccine will do to minimize the likelihood of reinfection, I think we still need to be vigilant. We need to be really careful and assume that you can be reinfected and wear those masks and maintain all the precautions to prevent infection and transmission.
I've read you have to, we're still going to need to wear masks even after getting vaccinated, just to prevent asymptomatic community spread. So what I've read is that we'll probably need to wear masks, into the latter part of next year, just to keep each other safe. Here's a question, completely different topic, from Kathy. And Kathy asks, can you please explain the process for the January 6th meeting of Congress regarding ratification of the election of Biden? Is there any chance that the election results could be overturned? Kathy, that is an excellent question, and I've done a little research, as I'm sure many of my colleagues have, because this, ultimately, all the steps that we take post-election and before the inauguration, they are, sort of ceremonial more than anything else, but maybe not this year with regard to all these steps. So the Constitution directs Congress in a joint session to certify the Electoral College vote on January 6th. So you just saw that the electors came forward in the varying states, and they gave the president-elect, Joe Biden, 306 electoral votes. I believe President Trump got 232. The electors made their voices heard, and then we will certify that vote in the Congress. It's largely procedural, it's historically ceremonial, but members of Congress may object during that vote to the returns from any individual state as they are announced. Objections to individual state returns must be made in writing by at least one member each of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So if an objection meets these requirements, then the joint session recesses and the two houses, the House and the Senate, separately debate the question in their respective chambers for a maximum of 2 hours. The two houses then vote separately to accept or reject the objection. Then they reassemble in a joint session and announce the results of their respective votes. An objection to a state's electoral vote must be approved by both houses, by both the House and Senate, in order for any contested votes to be excluded. And while it's certainly possible that we'll see objections, Mo Brooks, one of my colleagues in the House, has said he's going to move that forward. I see it as incredibly unlikely that both chambers would agree to throw out the electoral college votes of any state. I think we just saw this reaffirmed by Mitch McConnell, believe it or not, who said that he thought it was a very bad move for any of his senators to agree to any of these sort of anti-democratic procedures that really undermine our institutions, undermine the free and fair election that we just had, and undermine the will of the American people. And we're going to do all we can to make sure that we continue to discourage those anti-democratic actions from moving forward. Here's another one. This is from Joe in Carlsbad. With all the craziness and insanity with Trump, I'm still deeply disappointed and concerned about the number of your fellow House representatives that continue to validate the baseless claims against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's election victory. In the coming year, how can you expect to be able to productively work with these individuals to get meaningful legislation accomplished? Well, Joe, I am also disappointed that 126 of my House colleagues agreed to sign on to the Texas lawsuit, which I found entirely without merit and in violation of the norms and principles that make our democracy what it is. I was encouraged that the Supreme Court unanimously and quickly rejected that lawsuit. But that being said, we still must acknowledge that there are 126 members of the House that, for whatever reason, decided to sign on. And that's something that I think history will not look favorably upon. But what I'm going to do is what I've been doing all along, which is try to find those members of Congress, whether they be in my party or in the other party, that want to work with me on the issues that matter to our district, whether it's environmental protection or climate change or veterans issues or getting the nuclear waste off our coast at San Onofre. I am always looking to find partners. And we found great partners, both in our party and in the other party, and that work will continue. But make no mistake, what has happened in the recent weeks with regard to these claims of fraud and so forth is unconscionable, un-American, undemocratic, and we've got to do everything we can to restore trust and confidence, and the American people need to understand this was a free and fair election, and we've got to hammer that home. Here's a new question. This is for you, doctor. Back to medical questions. This is from John. What is the value of testing healthy people?
Yeah, that seems like it's kind of ironic that we would test healthy people, but in the early days of the pandemic, scientists were uncertain if those who showed no signs of illness were infectious. Since then, we've learned that 40 to 45% of COVID-19 positive individuals who are asymptomatic, and that those asymptomatic individuals carry just as much virus in their throats, lungs, and nasal passages as those that are showing symptoms. So these asymptomatic individuals are capable of transmitting the virus, and in fact might be more likely to transmit the virus because they don't know that they're sick. And when somebody's sick, they tend to stay home in bed. When somebody's feeling well, they go out and and associate with other people. And so it's important to make sure that people who have had the possibility of being infected get tested so that they know whether or not they're infectious, and that they could be isolated until they've recovered from the infection and don't infect anybody else. So that it's important. I realize right now, though, we are at a period of time when the number of cases has grown so high. In fact, I just heard that over 24,000 PCR tests are being done every day by San Diego County Health Department, and about 8% of those are coming up positive. We have a very, very high rate of infection going through our communities right now, and the resources that it's taking to test people with symptoms and to do contact tracing and case investigations and isolation is really resource intensive. And there has been some discussion about, maybe not testing as many people who are asymptomatic, but then what we do is we run the risk that some of those asymptomatic infected people are continuing to spread the virus. So it's critical that people realize that you can be asymptomatic and still be spreading. And if you think you've been exposed, it's important to get tested.
Thank you, Doctor. Here's one from Pat, who asks, can schools open at full capacity safely under current funding? If not, what is the plan in terms of opening schools? Well, I guess, Pat, it depends on the school district. Not every district is the same. Not every state is the same. CARES Act funding from back in March and April provided an initial stopgap, but we have to do much more to ensure that our schools have the resources they need so they can safely reopen. And I was very encouraged to see, as I mentioned at the outset, the latest draft of this bipartisan relief bill has around $82 billion for our schools, both for K through 12 and higher ed. Look, it's desperately needed. In every conversation I have with every local leader of a school, it is essential that that funding gets to those schools as quickly as possible so that we can keep our educators safe, keep our students safe, and reopen and get kids back learning in classrooms, which we know is so critically important. What I will say is that even with more funding, the rapidly increasing number of COVID cases and deaths will probably still prevent schools from fully opening in person until that number goes down. Here's a question for you, Doctor, from Rose. And Rose has a question that's on a lot of people's minds. She asks, does the vaccine really prevent COVID-19? How do you know it does?
Well, that's why we do clinical trials. And so let me just tell you a little bit about the Pfizer vaccine trial that was just completed. This study included 43,548 participants who were randomly assigned to receive either the vaccine or the placebo, and neither the doctors or the patients knew who was getting what. Half got the vaccine, half got the placebo. At the end of the trial, they were looking to see whether or not people developed the disease, COVID-19, and whether or not the disease was severe. And so there were 8 cases of COVID-19 among participants who received the vaccine and 162 cases among those who got the placebo, which means that the vaccine was 95% effective in preventing COVID-19 disease among those people that received the vaccine. Also, the results didn't differ across subgroups defined by age, sex, race, ethnicity, body mass index, and the presence of coexisting conditions. So it looks like the vaccine was broadly effective across a wide range of the population, which is also very good. Importantly, the side effects that were observed among participants in the vaccine arm were characterized by mild to moderate pain at the injection site, fatigue, and headache, which went away after a day or two for the majority of the patients. But the incidence of the serious adverse events, like I mentioned before, was low, and it was similar in both arms, meaning that there really wasn't any serious side effects that appear to be due to the vaccine itself. Now, the second vaccine is the one by Moderna, which reported data from its 30,000 person vaccine trial showing that 185 cases of COVID-19 occurred among the volunteers who received the placebo. In contrast, only 11 cases occurred among the volunteers who received the vaccine. And there were 30 cases of severe COVID-19 in the placebo group and none in the vaccine group. One volunteer did die in the trial, and that person was in the placebo group, and there were no deaths in the vaccine group. Again, there's really no difference there, and you wouldn't expect that if there wasn't any effect of the vaccine on side effects. So while both vaccines have strong evidence of preventing the disease, neither trial was actually designed to answer the question of whether the vaccines prevent infection. So we know that it'll prevent disease, and it certainly will keep people out of the hospital and off of the ventilators. But until we have more data, we can't say with certainty whether these vaccines will prevent the infection. And therefore, that's why, as the congressman was saying, he's heard that for people who've been vaccinated, they should probably still be wearing masks, because until we really know how much of an effect it's having on preventing the infection itself, and whether or not those people who are infected who've been vaccinated can transmit the infection, we really want to err on the side of caution and continue to wear masks.
Great answer. And I didn't know those specific numbers. I knew the percentages, but that's incredibly encouraging. I heard also that we may see almost like a booster vaccine for nasal spray kind of thing that would try to deal with infectiousness as well. So I know they're working on that very hard. A lot of the companies are trying to develop that as well. Here's another question from a Dr. Gromas. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Doctor, who says, Rep. Levin, my name is Dr. Gromas, and I'm an emergency physician working at St. Joseph Hospital in Orange, the largest hospital and emergency department in Orange County, and one of the busiest ERs in the state. We're absolutely getting pummeled by COVID right now. The situation is dire, and I don't understand where the state and federal assistance is going. Well, first, thank you for everything that you're doing on the front lines of this to keep people healthy and to save lives. And look, I know that healthcare workers all across our district, the state, the country are exhausted. They are frustrated, and they're in desperate need for more help. And I hear that time and again. And we have fought throughout this pandemic to provide relief, resources for our hospitals, for our frontline workers. Many of you remember all the way back in May, we introduced the HEROES Act. And the heroes in the HEROES Act, among others, are those frontline medical professionals such as yourselves, putting the health and safety, your own health and safety on the line to protect the health and safety of others. What I can tell you is that we have in this new bipartisan bill, $35 billion in the latest draft that I saw for our healthcare providers. And I hope that will go a long way towards assisting you and others in need. There's also $6 billion in the latest draft that I have seen in the new bill for vaccine distribution, which is so critically important that we are helping our states. If we're expecting our states to do the work to distribute vaccine, we better be there with the resources at the federal level to help them do it. So that being said, I know this is a very, very difficult time still, as it is for everybody on the front lines of this. And I just want to again say thank you. And I will do everything I can to continue to try to spread good scientific public health advice and information, and to try to encourage everyone to follow the public health guidance to keep each other safe and to keep you safe as well. Here's one for you, Doctor. This is from Bob in Carlsbad, who asks, here's my question for Dr. Garfien. I'm 67, in good health, but I work at a very close physical level as an educator with high school students who I know have not been socially distancing. Where does that put me on the vaccine list? Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Bob, first of all, I commend you on working with high school students. That's a challenging group, and right now I'm sure they need the help more than ever, given how difficult it is for them to be in this unusual situation. So Pfizer is expected to be able to supply 2.9 million doses of the vaccine in the first few days, and up to about 6.4 million doses by next week. And between Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, once it's approved, they expect to be able to provide about 40 million doses by the end of the year. So it's clear that there's not enough doses of vaccine to provide to everybody that wants one right away. And as I mentioned earlier, the ACIP has come up with an interim recommendation for providing vaccine to the group at greatest need, which I've already said are the healthcare workers and long-term care facility residents. And those two groups together represent about 17.6 million people. So the ACIP is working on recommendations for who the next group will be. And those recommendations are expected to come out soon. Based on what's been coming out in presentations and in materials being provided to the ACIP that they're using to make these decisions. Some of the groups that they're considering next are non-healthcare essential workers and people who are 65 and older, and those with conditions that place them at highest risk for severe illness. So it looks like these next groups are coming down the pipe. It'll depend on how quickly the vaccines come out. But I'd like to also just sort of let you know that the states look to and follow the guidance of the ACIP. But these federal recommendations are not binding. So states really have the ability to choose on their own whether to follow the ACIP's prioritization sequence or to do something different. And according to a study by the Kaiser Family Foundation, most states, including California, are following the ACIP's recommendations for this phase 1A group, yet it hasn't been determined yet whether the California will include teachers as essential workers in the next group. I certainly hope so. As an educator myself and the husband of an educator, I think I've seen personally how important and how closely engaged with the community these individuals are, and I really hope that they get the same protection, as well as all the people that are, providing us with food and transportation and other essential services that we really need to be able to maintain our society.
Absolutely. I have two more vaccine-related questions for you. Here's one from Rona in Carlsbad. She asked, do you have to be a citizen of the USA to receive the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure really what's triggering that question, but I did a little research and I found that on December 8th, the president signed the executive order to ensure that Americans had first access to the COVID vaccines. However, this vague order seems to be directed more at preventing the sale of vaccine to other countries before there's enough doses in the US. And it doesn't mention anything about a citizenship test for those who receive the vaccine in the US. So as far as I know, there are no citizenship requirements for acquiring healthcare in the United States. There might be some requirements depending on what type of a health insurance plan somebody's seeking. But in general, if you can pay for the vaccine, you can probably walk into any clinic that's offering vaccine and get it. So I think that once the vaccine is available, it should be available to everybody. If anybody knows differently, I would like to be corrected, but as far as I know, there is no citizenship requirement for vaccine.
Thank you. Frank asks another one. We are Connecticut residents, but have plans to be in the San Diego area from mid-January until late March. Given that, do you see any issues around getting a vaccine as a non-resident of the state you're temporarily living in?
Well, welcome to California. Hopefully the weather will be nice for you while you're out here. The first question is whether the vaccine will be available for your risk group while you're still in San Diego. It depends on whether or not there's enough vaccine to go around, or whether or not you'll fall into one of those categories that would be offered the vaccine. There's a website called vaccinefinder.org, just like it sounds, vaccinefinder.org, that can help people to find out where there's a vaccine provider near them, and it'll be updated once the vaccine is widely available to the public. So that's one place you can look. I recommend that you talk to your healthcare provider in Connecticut to find out what they recommend for you as far as getting the vaccine and what group you might fall into. And then, as a reminder, according to the AARP website, visitors from other states or countries, including returning California residents, are asked to quarantine for 14 days after arrival into the state. And so these persons who are coming into the state should be limiting where they go and what they do to their immediate household until that 14-day quarantine is over. And just as a heads up, much of California is currently under a stay-at-home order, so hopefully you're not planning on eating out at all your favorite restaurants until at least this wave passes us.
I think that's extremely good advice. That probably not the best time to make plans for a vacation. Let's wait until this passes a little bit. But next year, by all means, we need those tourism dollars back. We need to travel. We need our visitors and our hotel occupancy and our transit occupancy taxes and restaurant revenue. We need it all back in a big way, but we'll get there next year. The next question is from Teresa in Carlsbad, and she asks, I agree with what you're saying about our common goal to fight COVID, However, I'm confused as to why Mitch McConnell is able to block relief, that's all caps, block relief, because it does not include a liability waiver. Well, Mitch McConnell, as the Senate Majority Leader with 52 Republican senators, has a great deal of power over what the Senate does. And he has used that power perhaps to a greater degree of obstruction than any past majority leader in the Senate. And he's made a habit of a lot of good bipartisan bills here in the House going over there and dying on his desk. We call it the McConnell graveyard. Unfortunately, the COVID relief bill since May has been collecting dust in the McConnell graveyard, along with so many other good bipartisan pieces of legislation. What he has been holding out for, the reason he hasn't come to the table in a good faith negotiation until very recently, is that in his view, the most important priority for COVID relief is to help big corporations with liability. The belief being that if a worker gets sick or dies on the job due to COVID, that the worker basically is on their own and cannot turn around and sue the corporation. And that's simply, I think, really anti-worker, anti-safety, and really will lead to very negative outcomes for all involved. I think, the priorities, the values are clearly inconsistent with my own. When I think about what McConnell said about the blue state bailout, when you think about California and how hard our frontline community has worked with the resources already spread thin, how hard our schools have worked, our police officers and firefighters have worked with resources spread thin. And the CARES Act funding has largely been dissipated for direct COVID-related expenses. I have 10 mayors in our district. 6 of them are Republicans. All of them, all 10, have acknowledged and have asked for more federal assistance to help balance the expenses from COVID. So it's not a blue state, red state thing. It really is just a statement that McConnell does not share our values on this. Now, what we've done in this most recent round of negotiations is we've said, okay, there are so many things that we do agree on. Let's focus on those, whether it's the funding for small businesses or the unemployment insurance or direct cash payments, or the money for hospitals or schools, or money for things like the vaccine deployment itself, distribution, so critically important, or for public transportation, making sure that our transit agencies don't go under. So there's great bipartisan agreement on all of that. We've decided to move forward with all of that, and it's likely being incorporated as we speak into a $1.4 trillion omnibus bill. So the total cost of the bill will be around $2.3 trillion, including all of our normal spending that the government does each year, along with the COVID relief. My hope is that we'll vote on it this week, and I'll be excited when we do. And we're not going home until it's done. Thank you for the question. I hope that makes sense. Craig in Dana Point has one for me, which he says, I'm sure that you, like all Americans, believe that ensuring our elections that are fair and free is of the highest importance. I'd like to know what you're doing to further ensure that only legal voters are able to vote and only vote once. Furthermore, I'd like to know what you're doing to investigate concerns expressed by many over the past several years, including Senators Klobuchar and Warren, about the potential for electronic voting machines to be manipulated. Well, as you know, and thank you for the question, Craig, elections are conducted by our county, by our state officials, and I think in Orange and San Diego counties, they do an exceptionally good job. And in fact, according to the Department of Homeland Security, the 2020 election was the most secure in history. And there are efforts, though, in the House to make things even better, more secure. Last fall, there was a bill that I supported called the SHIELD Act, authored by my friend Zoe Lofgren, the dean of the California delegation. We passed that bill in the House. We sent it to the aforementioned McConnell graveyard, where it's been sitting collecting dust for 6 months or longer. The bill would do 5 key things. Number 1, create a duty to report illicit offers of campaign assistance from foreign governments and their agents. Number 2, prevent foreign interference in future elections by improving transparency of online political advertisements. Number 3, close loopholes that allow foreign nationals and foreign governments to spend in U.S. elections. Number 4, restrict exchange of campaign information between candidates and foreign governments and their agents. And number 5, prohibit deceptive practices about voting procedures. Now, it certainly seems to me that ought to be a bipartisan endeavor, and it's inexcusable that McConnell will not even allow debate or amendment on that bill. As I've said ad nauseum, I don't expect McConnell to agree with everything we send him, but I do expect him to allow his members to mark bills up, offer amendments, hold hearings, debate the bills, and then send them back to us where we can, in a conference committee, we can work out the changes and actually get something done on a bipartisan basis for our constituents. But McConnell refuses to do any of that. He just lets them sit where they are dormant for months or years on end. And it's really unacceptable. And I hope that people understand what he's doing. Here's one. Actually, I've got a few last questions for you, Doctor.
Okay.
First one is from Rachel in Encinitas, who asks, Dr. Garfien, with your experience tracking tuberculosis here and in Tijuana, what parallels can you draw to the current spread of COVID? Both are now treatable. The FDA has approved remdesivir for patients requiring hospitalization. Both are contagious with prolonged contact with infected individuals. Why is the public health policy towards one not the same as the other? Why no lockdowns and required mask wearing to prevent tuberculosis?
That's a great question, Rachel. And before I dive into that, I just want to acknowledge our question from Frank. I probably was unfair in assuming that he was coming here on vacation. For all I know, he's coming to staff a hospital. And so for whatever reason, you're coming.
Good point.
You're welcome. Rachel, I'm touched by your knowledge of my research pre-COVID. I appreciate you bringing the attention back to TB, which is still present and it's often an overlooked disease. And so I think that's an important comparison between the two. Mycobacterium tuberculosis is a bacteria that mainly spread by droplets, whereas the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 is a virus that spreads both by droplets and by the smaller aerosols that can remain hanging in the air. Droplets don't travel as far as aerosols before they settle to the ground, and bacteria are larger than viruses, so they have a tendency to sort of come out and then settle to the ground fairly quickly. And so the amount of contact and time that you need to be present with somebody in order to get infected with TB is greater than it is with somebody with the coronavirus. So that's one difference. Also, TB is a bacterial infection, which if it's left untreated, the patient will progressively get worse and ultimately lead to death. And in the meantime, while they're infected, they're also spreading the bacteria to other people. Whereas coronavirus is a viral infection, which really needs to be fought off by the host, by their own immune system. And so treatments such as remdesivir can be helpful in trying to help the host immune system to fight off the virus and to minimize the severe symptoms of COVID disease. But it's really, it's a different process, and the person does eventually get over it. Whereas with TB, treatment is required with antibiotics for quite a long time in order to treat and cure the patient. Also, TB is a slowly developing infection with a long incubation period. It takes months to years to develop the disease, and people may not know that they're infected, even though they might have symptoms. It could be attributed to bronchitis and any other number of conditions before they ever realize that it's TB. Whereas COVID develops quickly, and its incubation period is, on average 5 days, but it's only, the range is from 2 to 14 days. So the progress of the disease is very different. Also, a patient with TB is estimated to infect about 10 to 15 individuals over the months or years of illness that they have it before they're diagnosed and started on sterilizing therapies. Whereas patients with COVID have been observed to infect dozens of people all in one super spreader event, as we've seen in the Rose Garden event to announce Justice Coney Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court. There was a wedding reception in Maine where over 40 people were infected, and there was a choir outbreak in Saginaw County, Washington. These are just to name a few. And so the transmissibility of coronavirus is way higher than it is for TB. And then finally, due to aggressive, proactive public health responses to TB, we've reduced the incidence of TB in California down to 0.00053%, and that's compared to 11.3% for COVID. So we have a lot more COVID circulating in our community right now that we need to worry about, because you're much more likely to come in contact with somebody with COVID and become infected than you are with somebody with TB. And that's due to our public health efforts. So while both of these diseases can and should be prevented through proper airborne infection control practices, they really are different. And I think that the emergent situation that we have to control this pandemic really trumps a lot of the other things that we might be doing to mitigate the transmission of TB.
Thank you for that excellent answer. Another question about transmission, and it goes back to what we were discussing before about getting vaccinated, but still potentially being contagious. And it's from Lori in San Clemente, who asks, if one person in a household is fortunate enough to get a vaccine and then gets exposed to an infected person, can the vaccinated person who does not yet get sick, who does not get sick, pass the virus on to another vulnerable member of the household who has not been vaccinated yet? And based on what you said before, you perhaps explain how being vaccinated and being contagious, people I think are misunderstanding, thinking that when you get vaccinated, all of a sudden you're no longer contagious. Sounds like that may not be the case.
Yeah, and that's part of the thing about the trials that were done. The endpoints that they were looking at were disease. So do people have symptomatic disease of COVID-19? What they weren't testing for is whether or not the people in the vaccine arm actually became infected and are carrying the virus. And so more research needs to be done to look at that information and to determine whether or not the vaccine really is preventing people from becoming infected. And if they're infected, presumably they have virus that's circulating in their nasal pharynx and in their lungs, and it could be expelled and it could be spread to other people. So for that reason, if somebody in the household is fortunate enough to get the vaccine, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily immune from becoming infected and spreading the virus to the other household members. It does look like it's highly effective in preventing that person from becoming seriously ill from the infection if they were to become infected. And so there's still a need to wear masks to protect those other people in the household.
Well, and here's the last question, which is the question I think on everyone's mind. This is from Nick in Carlsbad. Dr. Garfien, how much longer do you think it will be until we no longer have to take precautions around COVID and can get back to normal?
We'd all like to know that. So I'm not going to venture a guess of my own because I'm a terrible gambler. So let me tell you what a few other people think. Francis Collins, who's the director of the NIH, Tony Fauci's boss, has said that it'll take 80% coverage to get herd immunity. And that's not going to happen until at least summer of 2021, if all goes well. And by herd immunity, what we mean is that when enough people in the community are immune and they can't get infected, then they can't spread it to somebody else. And so if the people who can't get vaccinated for whatever reason, either they choose not to or they have some health condition that precludes them from getting vaccinated, if they're surrounded by people who are vaccinated, then if the virus comes into the community, they're sort of shielded, and we call that herd immunity. And it's believed that we need to get, around 80% coverage in order to reach that herd immunity. Another person, Dr. William Schaffner from Vanderbilt University Medical School, is cautiously optimistic as well. But again, he reminds us that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's not just going to end one day when the vaccine comes out. This is the time when we need to be extra vigilant, give our frontline healthcare workers and ICU nurses a break by not getting sick so that they're not overwhelmed, and just stick to it and continue wearing our masks and physically distancing. And then a third opinion is Paul Offit, who's a member of the FDA vaccine expert panel who's been reviewing the vaccines, and he predicts that 2/3 of the US population will need to be vaccinated before we get back to normal, which he thinks, again, won't happen until about fall of 2021. So this is definitely not the time to get complacent. This is a time when we really need to sort of step it up. We can do our part by wearing our masks and physically distancing, washing our hands, and just, stick it out a little bit longer. We can get through this. I know it's really tough. And the main thing is, this is a final thought here, is that we know now how the virus is transmitted. It's airborne. There is some potential for becoming infected from touching contaminated surfaces, but it's mainly airborne. And we just need to kind of stay far enough apart that we're not breathing each other's air. And I think that's really what it's going to take to prevent this from being spread.
Well, thank you, as always, for all of your answers, all of your wisdom. We appreciate you so much, and we're out of time, but I wanted to give you some time for any closing comments this week.
Sure, thank you. I would just like to sort of reiterate, we're not out of the woods yet, and this isn't the time to get complacent. And I would just like to highlight a new campaign that is being promoted by Dr. Osterholm from the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. He started a campaign called Stop Swapping Air, which basically means not being in an enclosed or indoor space with someone outside of your household or your pod, regardless of whether or not they're wearing masks. It's communicating and socializing virtually all outdoors or at a distance. So anything that we can do to increase distance, not social distance, but physical distance between each other. There's lots of things that we could do to stay socially connected, like we're doing right now by being on Zoom and talking to each other, writing letters, getting on the phone with people, moving your activities outside. If you're outside and you're, a safe distance apart, 6 feet or more, it's very unlikely that you're going to be breathing in that other person's air. If you do need to be in a closed space, wear masks, try to keep your distance, and try to make sure that there's good ventilation in that space and minimize the amount of time that you're there. I know it's the holidays and everybody wants to get together. There are things you could do, sit outside around on opposite sides of a campfire, or go to watch the sunsets at the beach, or visit online. But the thing is that it's really going to be hard not to be with our families this year, and I know that hurts, but it would hurt a lot more if one of those family members ended up with coronavirus and was not there for all the rest of the holidays. So keep that in mind. We're almost there. We're figuring it out. We're getting there, but it's not over, and don't give up yet.
Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Garfield, for those words of wisdom and for all of your advice this week and every week when you join us. I hope this was informative for our constituents. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy. This is going to be our last virtual town hall of the year 2020. What a year it's been. A very difficult year for so many, but hope is on the way in 2021. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. We can get through this together, and just do what Dr. Garfield has said all along. Wear your mask, socially distance, physically distance, follow the advice of public health professionals and scientific experts, get the vaccine when it becomes available. I hope everybody has a safe and healthy and happy holiday season. happy Hanukkah, happy Kwanzaa, Merry Christmas, all the other holidays, Festivus. I don't know what other holidays, lots of other holidays, but I hope everybody stays safe this holiday season. Of course, my office remains open virtually to answer any questions that you have. We are busy doing a whole host of casework right now. I really thank our staff for all their great work doing casework during this difficult time. And please stay safe out there. And we will see you soon after the new year. I'll be back. Unfortunately, the House rules will not permit us to come together after the first of the year on January 4th and January 6th, or January 3rd and January 6th, for the swearing in of new members and the vote we talked about with regard to the Electoral College. But I'm going to do everything I can in distance, Doctor. Don't worry. But we are truly, truly grateful for the thousands and thousands of people that have watched our virtual town halls, the dozens that we've done throughout 2020. And I'm grateful to my staff for making it reality, and grateful to my family as well. My wonderful wife, Chrissy, our two kids, Jonathan and Elizabeth. I miss you. I'll be home very, very soon as we get this bill done. So with that, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful night.